My last audition was for Julius Monk. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he produced reviews, very smart New York reviews at a place called the Upstairs at the Downstairs. And I went in and auditioned for him, and a friend of mine played. And after I thought I had done well, and we were walking along Central Park South, and I said, "How was I?" He said, "You radiated pure hostility." And I said, "You know what? It's time to quit. It's time to find something else." I literally threw my music in a trash basket. And that was my last audition.
Radiated hostility, not something to put on your resume.
Well, not something that will get you the job.
That was the voice of legendary Broadway producer and general manager Albert Poland. And it is my absolute delight to have him on as the guest of this episode of the Page and Stage podcast, where we explore the art and craft of writing and performance. As always, I'm your host, Jason Cannon, and this week we talk about the influence of Judy Garland on Albert's theater career, the evolution of Off-Broadway, the importance of honesty in storytelling, and the many memorable encounters Albert has had with other legends of stage and screen. But before we get to all that, a brief Page and Stage plug. This podcast is only one part of my story coaching work. You can check out everything I'm up to over at pageandstage.art, including my other podcast, 100 Plays, a storytelling resources page, archives of all previous podcast episodes, my own books and plays, and my weekly newsletter full of tips, tricks, inspiration, and encouragement for storytellers of all stripes. You can sign up for free and get the newsletter directly into your inbox each Friday, as well as every new podcast episode right into your inbox every Monday. Everything is free, but if you find value in all this storytelling content, you can financially support me at pageandstage.art or forward any of the newsletters or podcasts to other story-loving friends, or hire me outright as your personal story coach. So if you're working on a memoir, play, or speech, I cannot wait to hear your story. Now, let me tell you a bit more about my awesome guest, Albert Poland. Albert, in his 43-year career in the New York theater, served as general manager for more than 90 productions, including The Homecoming, Talk Radio, Glengarry Glen Ross, The Boy from Oz starring Hugh Jackman, Long Day's Journey into Night, Gore Vidal's The Best Man, Dirty Blonde, The Last Night of Ballyhoo, The Grapes of Wrath, and the original productions of Little Shop of Horrors, Steel Magnolias, and Steve Martin's Picasso at the Le Pan Agile. And that just scratches the surface. He's won a couple armloads of Tony, Drama Desk, Drama Critics, and Outer Critics Awards. Albert also operated the Astor Place Theater from 1977 through 2000, during which time it was host to such long runs as A Couple of White Chicks, The Dining Room, The Foreigner, and Blue Man Group. He is the co-editor and author with Bruce Mailman of the Off-Broadway book, and in 2019, Albert wrote and published Stages, a theater memoir, and it is packed cover to cover with stories of theater legends. As a performer, Albert appeared at Carnegie Hall, La Mama, Judson Poets Theater, and the Village Gate. But Albert's first venture in show business was as the founding president of the official Judy Garland fan club in 1955. Here we go with my conversation with Albert Poland. Oh my goodness, I am so lucky. This is great. I have Albert Poland here with me today on the Page and Stage podcast, legendary Broadway, New York producer, general manager. He has worked with everyone famous that you can imagine. He has been by their side. Albert, thank you so much for being with me today.
My pleasure.
All right, I got to jump in with the obvious hook. I love to always open by asking about the storyteller's origin story, how you got into theater. But I'm guessing it's attached to the fact that you were the founding president of the official Judy Garland fan club in 1955. You even sent me a picture of you with your arm around Judy Garland, so I have to start there.
Well, Judy sort of confirmed what I had always wanted. I went to see A Star is Born. It was the first movie I saw by myself. I sat through it 3 times, and it was 3 hours long, as you may know. My parents called the police because I was away for 9 hours.
Oh, so you mean you sat through it 3 times consecutively in one
That is
day?
correct. Yes. Yes. I arrived in the afternoon and got home about 11 at night.
Oh my goodness.
And as I say, my parents called the police, but it was too late. I had escaped. I come from the Midwest, and I didn't find my family environment to be very joyful and very entertaining. And I soon discovered that I loved show business. And my initial love was for the movies because that's what I knew. We didn't yet have a television. That's how old I am. And I read about 20 movie magazines every month, and I began to read about Judy, making her comeback in A Star Is Born. I loved her look, and I loved the drama of her life, so I ran to see it. And for a long time, I viewed my life as before and after A Star Is Born. The newsstand next to the Indiana Theater in Indianapolis was still open when I left, late at night. And I picked up my first copy of Variety. And it just seemed like show business was within my reach. And it was a wonderful feeling. And Judy is the person who made that possibility seem real. I thought she was the most talented person I'd ever seen, which I think to this day. I think she's the fullest realization of, to me, what talent is. And singing, dancing, and acting to me are skills. Talent is the source that informs the skills. And I think hers is the richest I have ever encountered. It's just divine. It's perfection. And I saw a documentary on streaming about the Chicago Bulls. And I watched, Michael, I can't think of his last name because I'm old.
Michael Jordan. This was The Last Dance. Yeah, I think that was a great
I
documentary. Yeah.
watched Michael Jordan playing, and I thought that is how Judy performed. They both had a similar greatness. They had all the grooming, all the lessons, all the coaching, all this and that. When they got out there, it was instinct. And their instinct was utter genius. And I really put them in the same class. I just thought he was awesome. And I was so glad that I saw that documentary. So, I went to the library and began reading theater arts. And I noticed that the people in the theater weren't as pretty as the people in Hollywood.
Now, wait a minute, Albert. Come on, look at us guys here.
I'm sorry, but to my young eyes, it was very apparent. And I began to think, well, I don't know. I don't know if I'm going to be handsome enough to be a movie star, which was my goal at that time. And then I did go to college for a year. I did 4 shows and very little schoolwork.
4 shows in a year is a lot, yeah.
I had a couple of professors who liked me, and one of them noted that I constantly spoke about show business, show business, show business. He said, Albert, you've got to stop thinking about show business and think about the theater. That is where you are going to find your way.
Huh.
And so, I hadn't really considered that I would go into the theater, but he sort of pointed me in that direction. So, I quit school after a year and came to New York. My first air flight, I was 19 years old, and my first time in New York, obviously. And, I had been looking forward to that moment for most of my life. I just sort of waited it out at home in my home life until that moment arrived when I could finally spring. And I did. I listened to Manhattan Tower, the Gordon Jenkins album, until the grooves were worn out. And of course, the city was nothing like that. I saw this smog-covered skyline in front of me, and the choruses of Manhattan Tower sort of evaporated, and the absoluteness of what the city was immediately asserted itself.
Yeah.
And I went to the theater wing where I had an audition to go to school at the American Theater Wing. And I was afraid my suitcase would be stolen, so I took it on stage with me. And Helen Menken and her assistant looked at me and rolled their eyes. She later told me that I was the greenest thing that ever crossed the threshold. And I began to have a somewhat of an acting and performing career. I understudied Rolf in the Henry Gettles tour of The Sound of Music, and I was in a nightclub act. I had my own nightclub act, but I wasn't really moving forward the way I wanted. My life has a good synergy to it. I sort of follow the road signs, and I met a young actor whose father was one of those poor Jewish immigrants that started industries at the turn of the century that never before existed. And he started by selling peanuts in banks in Buffalo. And by the time I came along, they owned 800 different businesses, including the Cincinnati Gardens, the Cincinnati Royals, the Boston Gardens, the Boston Bruins, to name but a few. And they owned the concessions in most of these places. They had recently acquired the vending machines in the New York subway. And for some, quirky reason, they put me in charge of revamping how the vending machines were serviced and repaired, because they'd been losing money for 10 years. And it turned a profit for the first time. And I thought, maybe I can go back into the theater in a business role as a producer and manager. I can give people jobs instead of standing on a stage begging for a job, which I didn't like. I didn't like being in that role. And I also thought that the people who were auditioning me were hostile toward me, which they weren't.
Oh, interesting.
Right. I just assumed that they didn't know what they were doing, which is probably pretty arrogant. But when I did my first show and began auditioning actors, I realized that you sit there wanting every person to be it. You want them to be great. So I had that all wrong. But
yeah, I love that, Albert. I say this when I'm teaching audition workshops. I tell the same thing, that look, it's not a combative room unless you make it a combative room. That auditor there is rooting like hell for you to be perfect, because then they can check it off their list.
I did make it a combative room. My last audition was for Julius Monk. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he produced reviews, very smart New York reviews, at a place called the Upstairs at the Downstairs. And I went in and auditioned for him, and a friend of mine played. And after I thought I had done well, and we were walking along Central Park South, and I said, "How was I?" He said, "You radiated pure hostility." And I said, "You know what? It's time to quit. It's time to find something else." I literally threw my music in a trash basket. And that was my last audition.
Wow. Radiated hostility. Not something to put on your resume.
Well, not something that will get you the job.
Right. So you have at this point, you have decided to come back into the theater via the business route, general management, producer. And I know a lot of my listeners, we know those terms, right? But what's trickier is, what's the day-to-day look like? Like, we know an actor gets a script, learns a line, goes on, learns their lines, rehearses, performs, a designer designs. But what does a producer / general manager do? Like, well, what are the tasks that you accomplish?
There are actually two different roles. The producer chooses the project. Whatever the project is, it's the producer's choice. And the producer raises the money for the project. The general manager is employed by the producer. As a general manager, I negotiate and draft all of the agreements covering the show, the author's agreement, the director, the designers, the actors, all of them. I do the budgets, the production budget, how much it's going to cost us to do the production, and the weekly operating budget. And it's up to me to run the show as a business operation. Mm-hmm. I began as a producer. I produced the touring company, the Fantastics, when I was 24. It was on the road for 2 years. It was very, very successful. And I thought, well, this is the way it's going to be. Anyway, and then, David Cryer was my producing partner. We did a show in New York called Now Is the Time for All Good Men, and it was not the hit that we wanted it to be. And I gradually evolved into the role of being a general manager because I felt I was better suited to it. I am so in awe and worshipful of talent. And really, you have to consider yourself an equal to the talent you're working with. Producing, to me, at its best, involves alchemy. Merrick knew how to cajole, stir, kiss, caress, smack, all of it. And I wasn't capable of the smack part. I couldn't insert myself in that way. I remember my good friend Mark Bramble telling me about writing 42nd Street. He and Michael Stewart wrote it together, and Merrick would alternate between "this is superb" to "you've taken the film script and run it through the typewriter." Well, that was Merrick's great skill, and he got people's best work out of them.
You were good with the carrot, but not the stick.
That's well said. I like that very much. I try to remember that and use that. I did a show called Futz And we decided, I was not the main producer of it. The main producer was a man named Harlan Kleiman, and we realized that if we moved from the Theater de Lys to the Actors Playhouse, which was a difference of 150 seats, we would cut $3,000 a week off the operating costs, and we weren't selling it to capacity anyway. So we moved, and the manager of the show said, "Well, I'm not going to move with you." And we're standing on the sidewalk in front of the de Lys, and I said, "Well, who will we get?" And they both turned and pointed at me and said, "You." So my career was born on Christopher Street in front of the Theater de Lys.
Albert, that's a great title for your memoir. My career was born on Christopher Street.
Not a street known for its birthing rate.
Right.
Anyway, and so I made it conditional that the general manager of the show would give me a 3-day crash course, which he did to his eternal regret. He went around for the rest of life saying, "I created a monster," But, being a general manager was my career, and I'm so thankful that I found my niche, because I could not have had a better time. I worked with all the people I wanted to work with. I knew the people I wanted to know. I was able to pick and choose the shows that I did, with only 2 exceptions. There were a couple of shows that came along when I had to put food on the table, and so I took them. But really, out of 93 shows, 2 that I didn't really want to do isn't bad.
That's a pretty good batting average, yeah.
And, I turned down some big hits in the process. I was the first person to be offered Grease, and I turned it down. But I don't have any regret, because I was not the right person for it. I went to see it and I still didn't like it. I could see its value, but it wasn't my sensibility. I regret having turned down 2 shows, Cloud 9, which Tommy Tune directed Off-Broadway. That was offered to me, and I turned it down. I ran to see the first preview, and I knew I had made a mistake, and I had. And the other one was Hedwig and the Angry Inch. But they were both, to me, Albert Poland Off-Broadway shows, the kind of show that I delight in doing. I turned down Hedwig because I was busy doing Wait Until Dark, starring Quentin Tarantino.
Oh, wow.
Who was, it was great fun to work with Quentin, but he's not one of our great actors.
He is not, but that's okay. He does other stuff really well.
He certainly does. And he had 500 people waiting for him by the stage door every night.
Of course.
I mean, he was a charismatic cult figure, if ever there was one.
Yeah, Albert, you just mentioned an Off-Broadway Albert Poland show. And Off-Broadway was something I really wanted to ask you about. So I'm going to bookend this and then set you up, okay? So in June of 2019, the Off-Broadway Alliance presented you with the Legend of Off-Broadway Award. In 1972, you were co-editor and author of the Off-Broadway book. Your career basically coincides with the birth of, more birthing, the birth of Off-Broadway. I would love for you, as an insider to that, to talk about why did Off-Broadway manifest? What was the need for it, the drive for it? Why has it grown the way it has? You were part of the beginning of it in the 60s. You wrote a book about it in 72. You were honored in 2019 as a legend of Off-Broadway. You just mentioned that that's your sensibility. One of your main sensibilities is an Off-Broadway Albert Poland show. Teach us about Off-Broadway, Albert. How did it come to be? Why is it so important? Why is it so close to your heart?
Well, Off-Broadway is an upstart, and so is Albert Poland. I am a rebel, Mr. Mushnick. Off-Broadway really has been around since the 20s in one form or another, but the modern Off-Broadway movement, I think it's acknowledged that the beginning of the modern Off-Broadway movement was Summer and Smoke with Geraldine Page at Circle in the Square in 1952. Because that was the first time that the mainstream newspapers and periodicals like Time Magazine and so on took notice that this place existed. And almost immediately after that came the Threepenny Opera, which ran for 7 years at the Theater de Lys and put that theater on the map. And I consider Lucille Lortel and Ted Mann to be the mother and father of the modern Off-Broadway movement. I happen to know them both. one of my favorite reviews of my book Stages, Patrick Pacheco said, Lucille Lortel steals every page she's on. She was, I just think that I was fortunate to know people who were real characters. I mean, every last one of them. And Lucille was certainly a wonderful character. And she and I had some spectacular fights. I had to call her once. She actually put money in Uta Hagen's Mrs. Klein production. And she got billing as a producer as part of her contract. If you rented her theater, you had to give her billing as producer, even though she didn't do a thing. But on this production, she did make an investment. And her deal was that she would have billing alongside David Richenthal, who was the main producer. Well, when it came time to do the ad, there was a trend at that time toward what we call movie billing. It was continuous billing. You'd have a line of billing and then you have the next line of billing with more than, two names on the line. It would be however many names fit on the line. Well, billing was very important to Lucille. It was part of her self-aggrandizement. And had Ben Sprecher, her manager, call me and complain, and she was very unhappy, So the producer called her and said, Lucille, we're doing movie billing. It's a style of run-on billing, and it's movie billing. And she said, if I wanted movie billing, dear, I would do movies. That was Lucille. Anyway, Off-Broadway, it's changed, of course, as everything has. It was a place, like I say, it was an upstart. You could do edgy work, and I did come along very shortly, I would say, after the beginnings of it. But I was in there fairly close to the beginning. I don't consider myself one of the pioneers. I think I'm a second tier. But the pioneers were still on the premises, and they were part of what attracted me. I was brought into an equity negotiation. And I looked around at this group of people and I thought, this is my community. These are people I love. They were rough riders. Joe Papp came in an old wrinkled leather jacket, and his hair was a mess. And he sat down, and there was Lily Turner, she was a dowager empress from the Bronx. And she came up to me, I was sitting at the table. I was the first to arrive. I was the only person sitting there. And she came up behind me and said, I want that chair. I'm a lady. So I gave her the chair. I was pissed off, so I sat down next to her. She looked at me and she was amused that I had done that. And the relationship went on like that for decades. Community, which I just loved. And I had the same feeling when I watched the Academy Awards recently. The Academy Awards, the film community is an international community. And they love each other and they're very congratulatory of each other. And there's a variety of people of races and colors and countries. And I love that. It thrills me. That's what I like. That's what I want.
Albert, yeah, you mentioned your book Stages, and I wanted to make sure that we talked about this. So in 2019, same time you were named Legend of Off-Broadway, you published a theater memoir to great reviews. It's jam full of stories. And you also have a second book coming up called Two Shades Darker. I just want to give you some space to talk about what inspired you to write Stages. What was that experience like? You had written a book you'd co-authored a book back in 1972, but to write your own book, was it you? Were you pulling stories? And what was your process to create a memoir? What was that like for you?
It was the height of nerve to think that anyone would have any interest. What gall, It actually took me 25 years to write it, but there were periods of 5 years when I wrote nothing. When I sat around and said, who is going to give a flying, who do you think you are, I don't know. At some point I just said, you know what? I think I've had an interesting life, so I'm just going to write it. And so I did. And, it kind of occurred at the end of my career, and it's been the perfect career capper. The response to it has been beyond what I could have ever hoped for, beginning with, my dear friends at the Schubert Organization gave me my launch party in their penthouse in the Sardi building. And
wow.
It's like everyone that I loved in the theater, almost everyone, was there. And it was the warmest evening that you can possibly imagine. I will never forget it. It was probably the happiest night of my life. And as I was sitting there, in front of everybody with my book, getting ready to say something, I realized that I had had a 50-year relationship with the Schubert organization, beginning
Wow.
beginning with Jerry Schoenfeld and Bernie Jacobs. My relationship with them began with them being my lawyers. I did a couple things that they admired, and I was looking for a lawyer, and somebody said, Jerry Schoenfeld and Bernie Jacobs think very highly of you. I said, what? And they said, yeah, why don't you go? They may want to work with you. And I went to them, and they did. And then, of course, there came a time when they became the Schuberts. They were no longer the Schubert lawyers. And our friendship remained. And I ended up doing 10 shows with them. And the first one was Little Shop of Horrors,
Wow.
which was, just an amazing beginning. It was their first off-Broadway show, the first off-Broadway show for Schubert. And of course, it was a huge legendary hit that is in a revival right now that's leading the pack off-Broadway, which is very gratifying because, I believe that the only lasting thing we have in the theater is our literature. The rest is ephemeral. And so for a show to have a revival for 40 years later and be a success, it means the world. It's the best that can happen.
Yeah, I love that, Albert. I want to press on that just a little bit, and then we'll come back into your books. But yeah, I had never heard it put that way. That because I mean, you know this, a video of a play rarely, it does not capture the true experience of that live performance in a way that when you're in the audience in that community collectively experience it. But I love what you just said, that all we have is the literature, which is why revivals can be so important and so potent. I mean, why do we even still do Shakespeare? It's because, to your point, the genius, the talent of the literature speaks to something so universal that we can keep reinterpreting or rehearing that story again and again and get something new each time. But each performance, like you said, it's moonlight in the hands, right? We can't capture. You don't want to give someone a DVD. It's the experience and your memories of it are what matter.
Well, when you're saying this, the immediate thought I have is Three Tall Women. There was the original production of it, which I was going to be involved with, but the producer I was working with, unfortunately, was seriously ill and could not continue on it. But we knew that it was a gem. We knew that it was a diamond, which it was. And then Joe Mantello did it, I don't know, 10 years later or whenever it was, with a completely different approach that was just dazzling, and that kind of evolution is so gratifying. That something can withstand new light being shed on it or being put in a new context. I think Joe is just such a brilliant director. I did only one show with him. It was a revival of Glengarry, but it was perfect. We won the Tony Award, and it was just perfect.
Yeah. Great. So let's come back to your book then. So you're having the best night of your life up on the top of Sardi. As that night passed and the book started having its life and the reviews did anyone come up to you and remember a story you told differently? And kind of corollary to that question, as you wrote the stories down and kind of curated them from your memory to the page, did you see the story differently? Did you learn something about yourself in the process of getting these stories down onto the page?
That's a very interesting, challenging question. The first thing that comes to my mind is a little not what you're talking about. I did 2 shows with Sam Shepard, and it seems like somebody's always writing a book about him. And there's a very fine author named Robert Dowling who has a book in the works. It's coming out next November. And he had read what I wrote about Sam in my book and what I had said about Sam in other people's books and so on and so on. And, I remembered the opening night, among many other things. It was a classic off-Broadway opening night of that time. It was fraught with danger. Sam got into a fist fight as the critics were leaving the theater. We then went to a club, on Union Square, which I had rented until 2:00. We had a rock band. And at 12:30, one of the waiters says, the owner wants to see you. And he was on a different floor. And I went up there and he said, you're out of here at 12:30. I said, no, I'm not. I have this until 2 o'clock. That's what I paid for, and that's what I'm going to have. He said, you are out of here at 12:30. And he stood up, and there was an imprint of guns under both of his breast pockets of his suit. He said, in fact, you're out of here now. And we were. Well, my memory was that the next morning on the front page of the Daily News was a picture of the building, which was a pile of rubble. It was blown up because it was the headquarters of the Black Panthers. Yeah, it was blown up at 3 a.m. So, Robert Dowling said he is a fact checker, and he said, I can't find anything about this in the papers. And I said, well, that is really odd, because I remember it as being on the front page of the Daily News and da-da-da-da-da. Well, he looked further into it. It happened a week later. We were ordered out of the club for whatever the reason might have been, but the explosion happened a week later. It did not happen that night. And that is how I honestly remembered it.
Isn't that so interesting? Yeah, I'm in the middle of, I just took a memoir workshop a couple of weeks ago, and I'm teaching a memoir class right now. And that's a big thing that keeps coming up, is that as a memoirist, you also have to sort of be investigative journalist, because that fact checking, you're right, our memories, as potent as they are, get lots of things wrong.
Well, I didn't have a shred of doubt that I had seen this photo on the front page of the Daily News the morning after we opened. To me, it didn't need to be checked.
Right.
But obviously it did. I ran into people who remembered things differently than I did. And what I said was, well, I'm telling the story. When you tell your version of it, you can tell it in your version.
Right, exactly.
But I wrote my version, I kind of pride myself on my memory. And also, my father raised me to be very honest, which I thought was like C plus, but it wasn't. It's rarer than one might think. In fact, rarer all the time.
All the time.
So, that's another thing that people have liked about the book. They feel I'm being honest, sometimes to my own discredit. But what my goal with the book was to give an intimate portrait of what it was really like, of what the process was like. That was my favorite aspect of it, was the process. It was nice to have a hit. It was not so nice to have a flop, but the process was what exhilarated me and what I loved. And the people that you were engaged with in the process. And one reason I left is because it used to be a matter of working with 2 or 3 people who were really producers. And it became a matter of, and I'm serious, it became a matter of working with 25 people who wrote a check and thought they were producers.
Right.
And I just was not enjoying it at all. But I kept getting good shows. And like I say, my last show was Pinter's The Homecoming. That was a damn good production.
I love that play.
Yeah, well, it was, and Dan Sullivan directed it, and Ian McShane was in it, and Eve Best. It was a superb cast. I'm such a romantic. I thought going out with a show called The Homecoming, something nice about that.
Yeah, bring it all the way back. Yeah. It's fun. This goes back to the thing you said about the literature, Albert, is that one of my first professional roles in St. Louis was playing Lenny in The Homecoming. That was one of my first big roles, kind of cutting my teeth. And I'll never forget that director. I'll never forget that I was not a smoker. And so we were, there's a lot of smoking in that show. So we were trying to cigars, cigarette. And I just couldn't get the cigarette thing to work, to not look ridiculous, because I couldn't not cough. So they ended up having me, I think it was peel and eat an orange instead of smoke a cigarette, because it was about the activity, right? The tactile and mouth activity of the cigarette is what mattered in the scene. So doing an orange kind of got the same idea, even if it wasn't actual smoke.
Well, I did a production of Present Laughter with Frank Langella, and Scott Elliott, who I think is a very fine director, directed it. And my goodness, they just smoked up a storm. Everybody was just practically lighting their cigarette off the last one. And I don't know, let's see, about maybe 8 years later, Liev Schreiber was going to smoke in talk radio. We had to get a license. It was just an amazing, astonishing difference. And we had to have ventilation pulling the smoke up through the, flies, and we still weren't getting anywhere. And I was talking with the woman who was in charge, whatever the city office was, and she kept mentioning Liev. And I went to Liev and I said, how would you feel about writing a letter to this woman? He wrote the letter. We got the permission the next day.
The secrets of the general manager, right? You're just twisting arms everywhere you can. Carrot or stick, carrot or stick.
Now it can be told.
Oh,
another little secret was on the homecoming, we had our 25 check writers. I used to call them the checkbooks. And most of the checkbooks thought that shows should be sold using sex. Pinter had won a Nobel Prize for his body of work about a year before. So we come up with this poster for the show. It's a woman laying back with her knees spread apart and her dress pulled up over her knees. And I just looked at this and thought, this is just vulgar beyond. And I realized that I was not going to win an argument with these people. So what I said was, Pinter does not have advertising approval in his contract, but I think would be really well served to FedEx this over to him so that he doesn't see it for the first time in the New York Times.
Right.
He sent back a scathing email.
I bet he did.
The poster was changed.
That is very politic of that. Was smart, Albert. That was the right move.
Well, I let Harold Pinter fight my battle.
Exactly. Right. Proxy. Great. So I have a couple questions I want to ask, but first I want to give you a moment. So what is Two Shades Darker, your next book? What if you've already written the memoir? What is Two Shades Darker going to be about?
Well, it's sort of random chapters from my life. Some of them are things that I left out of stages because I felt that they either slowed down the forward movement of the book or were off the subject. Right after my first show in New York, I was the press agent for a tour of the Beach Boys and the Maharishi. You know, it's a very interesting chapter. It's a fun chapter. I took it out because my book is about a forward-moving theater career, and it just brought it immediately to a halt.
Right.
But I've added things to it. I added a chapter about my best friend, Bruce Mailman, who owned several off-Broadway theaters, including the Astor Place. And he owned the Saint Disco. He owned the St. Mark's Baz. And he was a very respected figure in the gay community, very public figure. He died of AIDS in about 1993. And I was pleased that when he died, there was a big hit in his theater, which was Blue Man Group. You know, and they just closed a month ago after 34 years. You know, I operated the theater for him. So there's a chapter about him. There's a chapter about Howard Ashman, you know, who was the author and director of Little Shop, and a chapter about a young producer named Steven Steinlauf, who was, when he was 19, he was an office boy for Merrick. And he moved Moon Children to the theater to lease. It had been a flop for Merrick, and he made it into an off-Broadway hit. You know, and there are other things in the book, but amazingly, the book has sort of turned out inadvertently to be about the 80s and about the AIDS crisis.
Oh, okay.
Both Howard and Bruce and Steven Steinlauf all died of AIDS, you know, and they were all brilliantly bright people. So I call it Two Shades Darker because I think that Stages is a pretty happy book, all in all, and this is a bit darker. So that's how I got that title.
Great. What is there a publishing date?
No, you know, I published Stages myself. I had two very fine agents pursuing it, and they were able to get nowhere after 3 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
You know, my present agent has a publisher in mind she's going to take this to. If they don't want it, I'm going to go again publish it myself. And I'll tell you, one thing I love about publishing myself, I am happy with every molecule of Stages. There's not one thing. It's a little long. I don't care. It's the book I want. I love the cover. I still get a thrill out of looking at the cover.
Yeah.
And, you know, so there's that. And I'm going to get a forward to this book, and I'm going to get the cover made before it's submitted to a publisher.
Totally. I mean, yeah, Albert, absolutely. I have a little imprint for that exact reason, is that as soon as you have a publisher involved, you don't get final say on edit, on cover design, on sometimes even title. I mean, it's wild.
What I'm saying to you is making me think of, I just listened to Barbara Streisand's autobiography. It was 48 hours of telling us that she's not controlling.
That's the that's the tagline. Oh my gosh, that's so good. All right, Albert, you mentioned the 25 checkbooks, right? And how those dynamics shifted. And you've mentioned your awe of talent. So as a general manager, and these wonderful stories about how you got, Pinter to fight your battles and how you have to leverage things and kind of work behind the scenes. I'm curious how you as a general manager, how much input you have to the story, to the art. Are you just the backstop, or have you had moments in your career where you've made an artistic or creative or storytelling suggestion to a director, a designer, the team? I'm curious if you hold a boundary there, or if you consider yourself as the general manager also part of the artistic side of things.
Well, when I was 8 years old, my father said to me, "Must you say everything you think?" And I said, "Apparently." So anytime I've had a thought, I usually tell somebody. And, I have made artistic suggestions. I've made casting suggestions. I can't sit here and recite what they were. And I've made designer and director suggestions. I have a philosophy that you figure out what a show is about, and you assemble a group of people that are going to resonate that. Every one of them is going to resonate what the show is about, And I'm also a believer in first seeing if there's an audience for what we're going to do. And for the first few months, you aim it at its obvious audience. Then you move it a little bit in that direction. You take that audience and add to it. Then you move it over here. We did that with Little Shop. Little Shop was a very hip show in the beginning. It ended up being a family show.
Oh, how interesting.
And our commercials were slanted to that. We brought our whole family this time. And I had a group sales offer. If you brought 15 people, you could have your picture taken in the plant. Bernie Jacobs wrote me back a letter. He said, "You just never quit."
It's amazing. Okay. You mentioned very early on, again, your awe of talent. Talent is the force, right? I love that. You've sent me so many great pictures. I just want to kind of mention a picture of someone that you sent to me, and you just give us the little nugget of a story, something about you and that person. And if you want to talk specifically too about their talent, that's fine. But just as I kind of rapid fire you these names, you tell us kind of what your experience with them was. So you've told us about Judy. You told us about Harold Pinter. Liza Minnelli has to be next.
Well, Liza was a member of my fan club. She was an honorary member. And when she came in, she played Lillian Hellman for 3 weeks in Are You Now? Because the producer was Frank Jarrow, and she was engaged to his son, Mark, at the time. And he took me to her dressing room and said, "This is Al Poland." And she said, "Well, I know Al." And she looked at me and she said, "Do you still have your Garland Gazettes?" That was the name of our fan club journal. And I said, "I do." And she said, "I still have mine." So we immediately hit it off. And she was very special to me throughout the 3 weeks she was there. She took me to Studio 54. She gave a party after her last performance and invited the cast and me. And, we closed the Promenade Theater. There was a rainstorm and there were 17 leaks over the stage. The stage was filled with buckets and she shouted over them. And she did it with great humor. But I moved us to a new theater the following Tuesday. We closed there Sunday night and moved to the new theater on Tuesday. We moved to Billy Rose's Diamond Horseshoe. So, there was that. And so, I ended up, she always knew that my love was for Judy. And there was something in the way she related to me that acknowledged that. But she was very kind. Couldn't have been more wonderful.
The Garland Gazette. That's incredible. I can picture you like at home, like you I'm guessing you had to like handwrite them or mimeograph, or like how did you send them out?
You got it. I don't
Oh
know
my
if you,
gosh.
you're much too young to have ever had the joy of typing a stencil. God,
Oh my
God
gosh.
forbid you make a mistake.
There's no going back.
You end up with a big hole in it and you just throw it away and start over.
Oh, man. That's commitment. All right, next, Hugh Jackman.
Well, again, I must sound like goody two shoes or something, but Hugh, I once told Hugh's mother in front of him that many of us felt she had created an exemplary human being. He is the nicest person that you can imagine. Um, it was so wonderful during that year of our run to know that if I wanted to, I could go and watch Hugh Jackman perform in The Boy from Oz. I did watch it 35 times, and I really
Wow.
felt that it was the best performance I'd seen in a Broadway show since Barbara Streisand in Funny Girl. And David Kolodner and a couple of other agents told me the same thing. They sought me out after the performance, said, "This is the show business we came into," you know. And
Mm.
Hugh was magnificent, and he gave 1,000% at every performance. He deserved the Tony, and I watched him become a star. And every time I saw it, I had to go back and tell him how great he was, because you can't not do that when you see somebody give that kind of a performance. So
Yeah.
I couldn't have loved
Wow.
him more.
This is so much fun. All right, Steve Martin.
Well, Steve Martin, first of all, I love his play. I don't know if you saw it. It's a feast. It's a feast about the 20th century, Picasso to Lapin Agile.
Yes.
He's a thoroughgoing professional. If you were alone with Steve, he was very serious. You would have a very serious conversation with him. If there was one other person with you, you became an audience. And he somehow went into a performance, and we had many dinners together, and people would come up to him and just, people would hand him their babies, and he would pat them and hand them back. They wouldn't say hello, thank you, or goodbye. He wouldn't say anything. He would just pat them and hand them back. It was just a routine, that happened anytime we went to dinner. And
Wow.
he had a play done in Poughkeepsie by New York Stage and Film, and we were having lunch, and a man came over and said, "We've been here for 1 hour and you haven't done one funny thing."
Oh my God.
And Steve said, "Well, it's the old me."
What an interesting perspective. Wow. Wow. I mean, you mentioned audacity earlier. I mean, that to me is audacity. Wow, wow, wow. All right, here's a favorite. Uta Hagen.
Well, Uta, believe it or not, was great fun. You think of her as this great lady of the American stage, but she was a very hip village woman, and she was a great actress, of course. We just had great fun together. We went to McBell's. It was a pub in the village, and we went to, we took the show to San Francisco, and she had a little dog named GB for GB Shaw, GBS, and she wanted the dog to be with her in the hotel, and she wanted to stay at the Clift, which was the best hotel in San Francisco. And they would not allow the dog, even though it was Uta Hagen, And she called me and she said, I was out there and she was still in New York. She said, "I just found out that Elizabeth Taylor stayed there with her dog, so see what you can do." So I called the manager. I said, "I understand Elizabeth Taylor stayed there, with her dogs." I said, "You have to understand something. Miss Hagen did the show on Broadway. Miss Taylor did the movie." He didn't know what I meant, but I had to say it. He said, "Actually, she didn't stay here. She did a press conference, and the dog was kept in another room." So I told that to Uta, and she ended up staying in another hotel. But I couldn't have loved her more, once again. And Christopher Street had changed since the last show that I did at the Delice, now the Lortel, of course. It had become kind of a honky tonk. It was very loud. People were setting off firecrackers. They had transistor radios, and the noise would carry into the theater. So, after we opened to the stunning reviews, Ben Brantley practically said she was on the Mount Rushmore of the theater. I called Lucille and I said, "Lucille, Christopher Street has changed. Can you build up the half wall into a complete wall, or can we hang velour in the back?" There was this long silence. And Lucille said, Tell Uta to speak up, dear.
That is so good. All right, we could go for hours on this, but one more, and then we'll wrap up with a spotlight for you. Cameron McIntosh.
Cameron Cameron is a very generous person to his friends, and I am a friend. And he is a mischievous person. There's always an air of mischief going on. He called me one morning and he said, "This is Cameron McIntosh. Can you have lunch with Tom Lehrer and me?" I said, "Well, it's the best invitation I've had all morning. Yes, I can." And Cats was already about to happen, and he wanted to do tomfoolery review of Tom's music songs, and we hit it off so well that we shared offices. We shared offices for about a year, and then when Les Mis came in, he was starting to get big and he needed larger offices. He invited me to come along, but I thought I would get absorbed in this huge office, and I wanted to be by myself.
Yeah.
But we remained friends, and I'm living in the Actors Fund home, and I'm on the Cameron McIntosh floor. And I told him that I knew him before he was the floor. and he sent me an email, and he said, if I'd known, I would have given more money. And what can I give you as a present? Would you like a pool? Would you like a revival of Follies? Would you like a mummy of Gerald Schoenfeld? So that's the kind of person he is. And he called me when he was 75 and said, I'm going to be 75. And I'm giving presents to certain of my friends to celebrate. And my financial officer will be calling you.
Ooh.
So he gave me a very nice gift to celebrate his birthday.
Wow.
So, that's Cameron. And he's the most successful producer in the history of the world.
Yeah. Well, like I said, Albert, I could probably just play this game for hours, but I'm going to wrap us up here. And I always wrap up with a spotlight for you. So I'm going to ask you just a couple questions, and then you can tell us how to follow you, how to find you, how to get your book, all that good stuff. So let's start with this. Like, what is your favorite story that you are currently reading or watching?
I'm actually listening to Foster Hirsch's book about Hollywood in the 50s.
Oh.
And I'm enjoying it immensely because that's when I was buried in the movie magazines.
Right.
So I read what the movie magazines had to say, and now I'm reading what was really going on. And Foster was a champion of my book. He tried to get me at Knopf, but they didn't want me. And he's the narrator. And I'm just enjoying it immensely, and I can't wait to write him an email and tell him.
Awesome. Great. I'll put that in the show notes. All right. I'm sure this is probably a big question just because of how many people you've worked with. But what is the best advice that you have ever taken?
Well, I don't know that this is the best advice I've ever taken, but it was damn good advice. And it was fairly recent. I was good friends with Tanya Grossinger of the Grossinger chain, in the Catskills. Tanya was a brilliant lady. She was a village lady. She lived at 1 Christopher Street, and she wrote 7 books. And she was also did the Playboy questions. When they had the Playboy interview, she was the person doing the interview. So she was the first person I sent my manuscript to of Stages. And she was a snappy talker. She said, "Okay, I've read this. Come in. We'll have lunch." So I came in. We sat down to lunch. She said, "First of all, I loved it. But second, you don't have to tell us everything you know."
That sounds like an echo of your dad, right? You have to say it.
It's the yin of the yang. But I said to her, I said, "I will not get a better note than that." And I realized that when you're doing a memoir, the first thing you try to do is remember everything. But the next step is to sift through it and take out the stuff that nobody is going to be interested in, or the stuff that slows it down or stops it even,
Yeah.
I went home and just slashed the hell out of it. And like I say, I thought it was the best note that anybody gave me. Somewhere, the advice I give people, and I don't know if anybody told me this or I just landed on it, follow whatever gives you your passion. Your passion has got to be engaged, because I'm now 83. If I look back on a career that I didn't absolutely love, I think I would be despondent. But I look back on a career that I consider to have been a feast. And that is the most gratifying thing in the world. It means the world to me.
That's fantastic. What a great place to land, Albert. Thank you so much. Last thing. So I assume, so your book is available on Amazon. I'll put that link right into the show notes for everybody. Do you have other places where people can communicate with you or find you or follow your work, website or social media, anything like that? Anywhere people can come learn more about Albert Poland?
I'm on Facebook.
Okay.
And I'm very active. I sort of treat my page like a gossip column.
Is that Albert Poland or Al Poland? I heard someone call you Al earlier in your storytelling there. Albert, great. So I will look you up and put a link right in the show notes for everybody. Oh my goodness, Albert, thank you so much for your time and sharing your stories. And man, oh man, wishing you all the best with Two Shades Darker. Let me know when that drops and we'll push that out too. But thank you so much and wishing you all the best.
It was a blast.
You've been listening to the Page and Stage podcast. All my thanks to this week's guest and to all of you out there for listening. If you enjoyed or found value in this podcast, I ask that you share it with at least one other person. Word of mouth has always been and will always be the best marketing tool in the world. I use an incredible online app, Riverside.fm, to produce this podcast. If you are interested in producing your own podcast or other audio or video content, I cannot recommend them highly enough. I've left a link for you in the show notes so you can check them out for yourself. The show notes are also where you can learn more about all my guests and access their websites and projects. I use Substack as my primary publishing platform over at pageandstage.art. The Page and Stage podcast is only one part of my story coaching work. You can check out everything I'm up to over at pageandstage.art, including my other podcast, a storytelling resources page, my own books and plays, my one-on-one coaching, as well as my weekly newsletter full of tips, tricks, inspiration, and encouragement for storytellers of all stripes. You can sign up for free over at pageandstage.art. Thank you again for listening. And until next time, I'm Jason Cannon, and I cannot wait to hear your story.